Okay, so today's podcast is one of those days where we are both very, very grateful to have each other as co-hosts on this podcast because
Definitely. More like I'm grateful that Katie's the ghost.
but it's so much it's a lot of fun. Like this is always how I envisioned it.
Mhm.
Like the back and forth between two people at least like kind of that I think that that's even biblical in the context of like the wisdom of multiple people
There's
versus
wisdom in the multitude of
yeah,
counselors. I think
yeah,
that's what it is.
yeah. Thank you for that.
I can't give you the reference. I think it's
But
probably
it's
in
there.
Proverbs.
Woo. Um, but I say that we're grateful for each other because, like every season in life brings a different kind of challenge, a different kind of routine. We've been talking on the channel, we've been talking a lot about like routine and both the pros and cons of trying to like over control your life, but also being responsible and a steward for what God has given you, like that kind of dance. And it's so appropriate that what we're talking about today in the context we're talking about is present in this section of content because I feel like you're in this season of moving into a house from an apartment, you're pregnant, you're due, like it's not
Two
that
months.
long way. And there's all of this routine that is so lovely and kind of, even our routines with the Lord in reading our Bible and spending time with him and doing that in a setting that isn't crazy and disorganized. All of like it's easy to take for granted all of those things. And yet
Mhm.
they aid to the calmness that we can have in those seasons. And so when you have those seasons of, habits being upset or just life changing, it can be, we can put a lot of pressure on ourselves to try to perform the same way that we do when we're in a season of calm and groundedness and like, we're seeing, the waves coming in and out of the beach. I mean, like, it can feel like we're almost shooting for every day being like that. And the reality is, it isn't. So I
Mhm.
wanted to talk today just in a real, genuine sort of way. None of this is scripted ever. Um, but to just talk about what that looks like, for you, it looks like a particular kind of season with this move and with the baby coming. For me, it looks like an interim season of sort of waiting, but also preparing for full-time school and some of the unknowns with that and all of the other things that I'm doing and building. And like it's different seasons. And that's what I love most about you and I doing this together is that we're both in very different seasons and yet a lot of the same lessons can apply.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Um, I was just thinking this morning, like it's especially this week because we're getting the house this week, and we're like packing and everything. I was trying to do my quiet time with the Lord, and I was like, I'm on this Bible reading plan. I'm doing the Bible recap, and I was supposed to read like 4 chapters, and I didn't read a chapter yesterday, or I didn't read 2 chapters, so I'd read like 6 chapters. And I was like, I am not ingesting any of this. Like, and it's First and Second Corinthians. Like, these are so deep. How am I supposed to like grasp this? But like, I read it, and then I was like, you know what, Lord, like, I just needed to pray to Him, like,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, just be like, okay, I'm not like, please forgive me, like, I'm not ingesting this, but like I think those things still count and kind of like giving ourselves some grace like you know it makes sense that right now I'm not super focused but like keeping God still in my thoughts instead of just like completely pushing him out,
Yeah.
like finding places where I can talk to him or I can talk about him or pray or sing or whatever. um but yeah, and it's kind of crazy thinking about like this is good to be thinking about because I know even as a mom, like my routines are going to be even more disrupted.
Yeah.
Like this week
Yeah.
it's disrupted. And normally I'm so used to like just having the day to myself and like, I work from home too. So it's just like I have my own schedule and blah, blah, blah. But when there's a baby, it's going to be very different. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like good to be thinking about like, okay, having the mindset of keeping, giving glory to the Lord no matter what season I'm in and no matter what the day-to-day looks like striving to have those daily routines, those spiritual disciplines, but also knowing that it's gonna look different in different seasons.
Yeah. And that's the sort of like, like detaching from how it needs to look. That is such a thing. It's such a
Hmm.
big thing. I think especially in like an oversaturated social media sort of world where
Hmm.
everything is picture perfect and you're seeing like 20 seconds of someone's whole day and it's like the best parts.
Yeah.
And you think that's how they live. And it's like baloney. That's not real. That's not true. There's so much in between that's happening. And do you know, it's funny. I'll share the story because it made me chuckle and think of what you just shared. I was dog sitting for a friend the first and the last time. And me and my sister were at their house. They were gone. We had the two little dogs. They're older dogs, like very nice. There's nothing wrong with them. But I had my big academic interview that week and I was stressed because normally I would be in my environment. I would have my, my computer powered up and everything ready. I'd have like I'm a planner. I'm an organizer. I love things being just so. That's a gift, it's a skill, but it's also like it gets in the way because then if things aren't the way that I would like them to be, then I have that sort of stress that comes up. And it was so funny because I've got these two little dogs trying to do this academic interview. My sister's working, and I was so stressed that week. And when I came home, I said, oh my goodness, if this is not a taste of having little people around, I don't know what is. I was like, the Lord is going to need to change some serious things in my heart before I become a mother of like caretaking for little living things, Like,
Little living things.
I was like, oh my goodness. And I kind of resolved after that. I'm like, if they are not my children, if I have not birthed them either physically or emotionally through adoption, that's always what my mom says. She's like, I birthed you just emotionally. It's like if I have not birthed them and they are a dog or an animal, I am not like, forget it. I am not a dog mom. I no thank you. I do not. Nope.
Too
But it was
unpredictable.
I know it, but it was such a lesson for me around like my attachment to things looking a particular way. And the I think it's a resilience that God teaches us to be
Hmm.
able to be okay with the unexpected. And that's been like really the big lesson this year in so many ways. And part of that unexpected is learning to respond in a way that glorifies the Lord even when it is unexpected, which is
That rem
challenging.
that reminds me of what you told me a while ago about your mom. I can't remember if it was on the podcast or not, but
Oh, yeah.
about how you were talking to her about like being a mom and like
Yeah.
how you didn't want to interrupt her or something.
Yeah.
Do you want
Yeah.
to
Yeah, I
finish the
will.
story?
Yeah. I was like, ooh, does she have the whole story? Is
I'm
she
not
going to
gonna
say
get it
the whole
right.
story? Well, and we may have said it before, but we'll say it again. My mom and I were having a conversation, and like I'm one of 10. There are only two of us at home now, so it's a whole different season for her too. Actually, this rolls in so well to this week too. It's so much fun. Okay. So my mom and I had had a conversation. I said, Mom, like I can wait. If I'm asking you for something and you're in the middle of something, I can wait until you're done, or I can wait until you have time to listen. And she said, No, like part of my role as a wife and a mother is to be interrupted. And I was like, What? I
Your
hate
mom
it when
always
I'm
drops
interrupted.
these
I know. I'm like,
amazing.
okay, what? Which is so the Lord because no one ever taught her, like, her mom and her were like the only ones. Like, it was just the two of them. And it was a very different dynamic with the two of them than it has been for her and her kids. So it's so the Lord that the Lord prepared her in particular ways that was so like culturally unexpected.
Oh.
Like, my parents were not the like perfect big family parents. You know what I mean? Like they were not they didn't have a lot of experience with kids. They didn't have a lot of experience in the ways in which they've had to step up and have responsibility. And yet the Lord prepared them in unexpected ways that ended up being very valuable for raising kids. And that was one of those things that I was just shocked by, because here I am like super annoyed when someone interrupts me. And even it's a very cultural thing too. It's like, we have our plans and we have our things, and that's great, unless of course it's inhibiting us from actually being ready and willing to be used by God in the ways,
Mm-hmm.
in the good works that he has planned for us. And that really comes back. We were talking about, Kasey and I were talking about the verses that we wanted to share with you guys. And um, I'm sure it's other places. We were commenting on the fact that I'm sure this is other places, but in 1 Corinthians 10:31, it says, therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all for the glory of God. It's a very famous verse, but it's surrounded by context that is so beautiful, because kind of the context leading up to it is this dialogue around food that has been served to idols. And if you think about that in context, like the Old Testament way was like, if something was offered to an idol, then you wouldn't eat it. It was not good meat.
Mm-hmm.
It was defiled. So it would have, like, you would have had like some sort of like curse or repercussion on your family, not just you, but your family. And when you think about like the new way ushering in the New Testament, and Jesus was so countercultural to what the Pharisees were teaching. They hated him. Think about it. These are the most like quote unquote godly representations of like, we hold the highest level of understanding of the Bible. And they hated him because he was changing some things
Mm-hmm.
and creating a level of, he was creating a leveling, like a leveled playing field. There wasn't this hierarchy anymore. And of course, people in power that had the advantage of that hierarchy, they didn't like that. So what's beautiful is like this pre-context to this very, very well-known verse is saying, listen, like, anything is good for you to eat now, but if the person that you're eating with is not saved, and now you're aware that this food has been served to idols for the testimony for you before the Lord and for them, for their conscience, then you wouldn't eat it. And that's a whole different ballgame, because that's really about caring about others and glorifying the Lord in what we eat, in what we don't eat, and why we don't eat it. Think about how many rules we've set in our culture. Well, I don't eat this and I don't do this. How much does that hurt the testimony and the fellowship of believers, and the witness to unbelievers as well, when we're so picky and so particular about like, this is the only way I do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very much not what the Bible talks about. The Bible's like, hey, anything is free for you to eat and partake in, as long as your heart is coming from this place of loving and serving and glorifying the Lord.
Yeah, and later on in First Corinthians, I think it's later on, he says, all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. And it's kind of having shifting that mindset of like, oh, I'm free to do whatever I want, and instead like putting others' needs ahead of your own.
Yeah.
Um, it's funny because when we went through First Corinthians at our church, I think it was last year, and the pastor kept pulling out the theme that the Christian life is a sacrificial life, like giving up your preferences. And it's like the day-to-day things. And it's like you think of like a Christian sometimes as like the ultimate like sacrifice or whatever, you're like giving up your life for somebody, like taking a bullet. But it's like it's those little moments of like, oh wow, if I eat this, then they're gonna think something about the Lord that's not true. And I don't want that. So I'm not gonna eat that today. Or I'll give it up. Um, but I think that's something that like the whole topic of glorifying the Lord, kind of what we were saying, like it's possible wherever you're at. And like there are so many ways to glorify the Lord, whether it's being interrupted, whether it's having a lot of quiet time, what do you do with that? Or like a busy season or a slow season. Like there are so many ways to glorify the Lord and to put other people's preferences ahead of your own. And we just have to like kind of keep our eyes open for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And keeping our eyes open to our whys,
Yeah.
because like everything about Jesus offering the gift of salvation became like, it's not about the rules anymore. It's not about you following the rules and checking the box. It's about what's going on in your heart.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
woo, it's a whole nother level, baby. Like it's different because it's not the external. I checked these boxes. I did these things. And
Mm-hmm.
really, truly, it never was because obviously the rules of the Old Testament didn't work, right?
It
So it
wasn't
was like,
enough.
so it just goes to show it was always about the heart. And we could see that in the Old Testament in so many ways. And so now it was like that public acknowledgement of like, gone are these levels of hierarchy in access to the Lord. And instead, the access is leveled. Like you can have a personal relationship with the Lord. You don't need the priests and the Pharisees to interpret for you what God has commanded you to do. You
Mm-hmm.
have that personal relationship with him. And that means that no one's with a valid excuse intact for, well, like for not glorifying the Lord, for not taking every opportunity to really lay things before him, to give up things for the sake of others. Like there's just so many ways. I think about I kind of, this is why I wanted to do this now, is like, even in the season of you moving, there's so much of your life that's kind of uprooted and like shifting and changing, and with the baby coming. And even in that season of like uncertainty, oh my goodness, what is motherhood going to be like? No one can really totally prepare you for it. Like there's so much, probably like nervous little butterflies in your stomach that are
Yeah.
not like, that's not the baby. That's
Nervous
me
little
being
butterflies
nervous.
and hormones.
And yet, like, even in that, we can say, God, like, I trust you, and I trust that you are preparing me even now for what you've called me to do. Clearly, this is something
Mm-hmm.
very distinct. Like, what a gift. Something like that, like motherhood, right? There's lots of things that we wonder, oh, this will go down a tangent, but it still is going on the glorifying the Lord. There are so many times in our lives where we can say, okay, I think this is from the Lord. I think this is a path I'm going to take.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's always the kind of like wondering in the back of your head, like, is this really the Lord? College has been that for me. Like,
Mm-hmm.
my goodness, like you still have opened the door. So I'm going to honor that and not shut the door out of fear or uncertainty or convenience. Like I'm excited about it, but there's also like, oh, and but then there's always that sort of like in the back of your head. The beauty of motherhood is it's like, girl, you got several months pre this baby coming to the world for you to say, this is obviously what the Lord willed for me in this season of my life, because hello, he's here. Like, you know what I mean? Like this is what it is. And yet it's still scary and uncertain, and it still absolutely requires you to like just plead before the Lord for being prepared and being willing and being useful as a mother.
Mm-hmm.
And
No, that's actually really encouraging. Like,
oh, I'm glad.
I know this is like primarily for other people, but that is encouraging for me because, like, I don't know, I think maybe hormones are just like really up and down right now, but I've been just like questioning, everything and just
Yep.
like, am I going to be a good mom? Like, how are we going to do this? Like, what's it going to look like? How am I going to handle it? Um, but you know, going back to the basics of like, okay, this is something that the Lord has for me. He obviously like okayed the plan
Yes.
and and there's no going back. So it's like
Yeah.
he's not going to throw me into something that he's not going to help me with, you
Yeah.
know? Um
Absolutely.
what's that verse that says like not that motherhood is temptation, but it says there's no like temptation that he won't deliver you from. Like I think that goes
Yeah.
for like any circumstance, like
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because the
any
because the
circumstance he
experience
leads me
itself
into
may not be temptation, but there's lots of temptations to be.
to believe other things.
Yes, there's lots of temptations that come with motherhood.
Hmm.
So absolutely. And those are the things we're most afraid of anyway, right? Like the like, oh, will I mess up or will I,
Mm-hmm.
and those are the temptations to not trust the Lord and to wonder, like, is it really right? Is this really the way it was meant to be? Like, did I miss something?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Watching my mom has been so encouraging on this because as she has all adult children and everyone is in different seasons and paths before the Lord as well, some walking with him, some not. And it's so fascinating because it, I think this season of her life is so emphasized that it's not about her. Like, it's not about how well she mothered. Like, absolutely, yes, that is a responsibility and a privilege before the Lord that you do your very best and
Mm-hmm.
you understand the weight of the role. But ultimately, every step of raising them is a um a step next to the Lord. Like you're locking arms. You're like, God, like, just help me to know how to respond. Help me to be humble, to be, like you in this moment. And even when I'm not, for
Mm-hmm.
that to be clear to them, for them to learn, to build wisdom. But inevitably, kids, as they grow up, as much as we wish these things, they learn so much with their own walk with the Lord. And that's often a lot of back and forth and frustration. Think about how much you and I have learned, even in the last couple of years,
Mm-hmm.
in seasons where we were really close to the Lord and seasons where we were further off, how
Mm-hmm.
much of that has taught us how to love him even more. I wouldn't trade those experiences for the world because they've brought me to a deeper understanding of who God is and a deeper love for him. And
Mm-hmm.
as much as like as a mother, we don't want those difficult seasons for our kids, they're a part of them having a strong and resilient relationship with the Lord too.
Yeah.
So much of motherhood is like letting go.
Yeah. And like, yeah, I think it's like the responsibility is like building a foundation, but then it's
Yeah.
kind of like, okay, do what you
Yeah.
will with it, you know?
Absolutely. Do you know what I heard somebody say? I don't remember who it was, but this is such a perfect reminder. I'd never heard it quite this way. Somebody, somewhere in the world
Sorry, somebody. We
that
don't know your name.
entered my sphere in the last 7 days said something along the lines of even the prodigals, even the kiddos that walk away from the Lord, that foundation that by the grace of God you've strived to build underneath them, when they get to the end of the rope, they still remember those things. They now have a foundation they can come back to. And in a different way, in a stronger way, in a sincere way. If that
Yeah.
foundation wasn't there, this was the best argument I've ever heard for raising your kids as a believer, raising your kids Christian, because you and I both know we were both raised in Christian homes.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different kind of challenge that our parents who didn't grow up saved necessarily or in different variations of that, right?
Yeah.
Where they got saved later in life, they don't quite understand what it's like for us growing up in a Christian home and getting saved. It's a different sort of challenge. It's a
Mm-hmm.
different sort of perspective. We don't have that about face sort of experience. What we grew up in is still what we believe, but now it's like personal. But the
Mm-hmm.
differentiation between those two things is sometimes different or less, maybe. And this was the best argument I'd ever heard because it's like, listen, when they have that foundation, they know where they can go back to. They know what's true and their heart knows what's true, even if their desires want something else.
Mm-hmm.
And that foundation is gold
Mm-hmm.
because when they have it, they can go back to it. They know what's true. If they
Yeah.
don't have it, then by the grace of God, somebody crosses their path that can show them that. But I really thought about that a lot this week because I was like, man, like I know that raising my kids as Christians is the right thing to do, but it feels like it creates this sort of like time and time again this sort of assumption that like, well, I'm saved because I was brought up Christian. And it's like, yeah, every young person who grows up has to go through that experience, but they still have that foundation of truth.
Mm-hmm.
And
And they're
you'd
going to
never
go
want to
through
give
something
them,
where
yeah,
it becomes real,
yes,
whether that's earlier or later.
yeah,
But the beautiful thing about our faith is that, like you had mentioned earlier, um, like your mom mentioning that it wasn't about her. Like, it's really not about us. And this goes back to the whole like glorifying the Lord thing. Like, it's all about the Lord, all about his
yeah,
glory and his goodness. And it's like, it's not like raising a child, you're raising them to come back to you necessarily. You're raising them to fall on the Lord when they struggle or when they need him. And it's like you're giving them the tools to know how to cry out to the Lord, or like to know where to go in the Bible. Like, where can I, like go to the Psalms when you're feeling like, desperate or whatever. Um, but yeah, I just love it that it's like it's not us putting our hope in a human or a teacher. It's in God himself. And
yeah,
he um like and he treats each person, like he talks to each person differently. So
hmm,
it's like the way that maybe a parent raises their child, maybe it doesn't quite click with them, but if they give them the tools, then um they know to go to God, and God can teach them in his way that's right for them.
yeah, yeah.
I don't know if I'm saying this all right because I haven't raised any child yet, but
I know. Yeah. But it's like, it's almost, in other words, like the lesson of totally trusting the Lord and not putting our faith and trust in circumstances. And those circumstances could also include our own will, our own skill, our own determination to do
Mhm.
something. That's also something else besides the Lord. Even though God gave us that skill and that insight, trusting in it is like trusting in creation instead of the creator who designed it for a particular purpose in a particular order.
Mm.
And that doesn't change. Like whether you're a mother or you're not a mother, that relation, like it it will change in like how it feels and what you learn and what kinds of things you learn. Like my mom says, it's one of the most heartbreaking and beautiful, incredible sort of things you could ever go through. Heartbreaking because kids do things that hurt their parents, and overjoying because it's one of the most beautiful privileges ever.
Mm.
And yet like it's still the same thing, right? It's like trusting the Lord completely and putting our faith in him versus the circumstances. And it means that when that's where we're putting our trust in and not our plan or our routine or our ability to organize, then we can actually be ready and available in all the ways for the uncertain things that happen,
Mm.
because God doesn't ever change, even though our circumstances do. And that's it's such a
So
reminder. It's
good.
hard. It's like easier said than done, but what a privilege that we get to be in that sanctification process with him and that he never changes. He's always dependable. I think that has been the most, like, I feel like a broken record this year, but like that is literally, I feel like I say it in everything that I ever create. Like that is the most comforting, like seal the deal sort of thing about God's character. He never changes. And he literally shows us what his character is like. We don't have to search far in the Bible to see it time and time and time again. And we can always depend on that.
Yeah.
It's like, whoa, okay. Like, I don't need to worry about my emotional state right now. Like, that's okay. And it's a passing, fleeting moment. And
Hmm.
it's not the end of the world because I'm not putting my trust in that. I'm putting my trust in a God who never changes.
It's so funny how easily we forget that. Like, I I forget what it was, but recently I can't, maybe we talked about this before in here. I can't remember what we talked about, what we didn't. But like I was worrying about something, and then I just like remembered, oh, I can trust the Lord with it. And it felt like this burden was lifted off. And I was like, why am I worrying about this?
Like,
Like,
how is
I
that
can,
so easy?
God is in
What?
control. Like, what am I doing? But it's like it's something we just need constantly reminded of.
Yeah. And that's why we need each other to remind us of it too.
Yeah.
Because, this is the gift of you and I being in different seasons is, like we can remind each other of things that seem so hard and impossible for us in the context of our life. But
Mhm.
when someone else can say, hey, no, like this is true. God's got this. It's like, oh, yeah,
You're right.
he does. Okay. Like
I think especially as, I mean, it's probably similar for guys, but as women, like our brains just go everywhere. And
oh,
it's just like someone to pull you, rein you back in and be like, remember this
100%.
truth.
Yes. Like emotional, hormonal, like up and down. Yesterday was a great example of that. I did not feel like any of it. Like I was just, and I was so looking forward to yesterday was like the first day in a really good long time where I didn't have a commitment to anyone for anything during the day entirely. Like that hasn't happened in a while. And I was like, I'm going to get so much done and let's do that. You know what I mean? Like, and then
Uh-huh.
my energy was very low. I was like up and down emotionally, like, oh, I don't want to do it. And yeah, like I had to spend some extra time with the Lord to be like, God, ooh, like, I'm feeling like, no, thank you today. And yet, like when we're faithful to use the resources that he's given us for that day, and that resource, the level of that resource, the way it looks may be very different from the next day and the day after. But
Hmm.
when we're willing and faithful to use the resources he's given us for that day and glorify him through it, it's okay. Like I don't need to compare my energy level from yesterday or the day after. Like, like or like my level of focus or my level of creativity. Those are all things that matter a lot to me, like
Hmm.
finding a good synthesis of them. But at the end of the day, it's like I let that all go because God is going to bring things to me that I didn't even anticipate or expect. And I need to be okay with that change because that change is always present and it's always there. It's like if there's anything that we can count on in our circumstances, it's change.
Yeah. And I think sometimes the hardest thing to overcome is like our own expectations of ourselves.
Yeah.
Like, and being okay that the Lord has like either taken something or given something to us that like changes our plans
Yeah,
or
absolutely.
expectations.
And
And
how we can
I've been having to learn that a
perform.
lot with
Yeah.
pregnancy and freelancing. Like, my schedule does not look the same with work like it did before. It's not like an 8 to 5. It's like, some days are a lot, some days there's nothing. And then with pregnancy, some days like I have tons of energy, some days it's just like gone. And so it's like, okay, we'll see what I get done today. Like this is I like to write out to-do lists, and Charlie finds them all over the place. I'm like, okay, this is everything I'm gonna get done tomorrow. I'm gonna do this, and I normally get like half the things done. On a good day, I'll get like pretty much everything, but like it's gonna be so hard to adjust to like, oh, I didn't get everything done on my to-do list. And it's like that's just like a Kasey made plan. Like
I know.
Lord does
Yeah.
not care about this.
Like it's okay, it like it and I think we could go a whole nother segment on like planning. I think we should definitely do an episode on like planning and like the balance there because as I said, I'm totally a planner. Like I have my planner right here. I am totally a planner. I love helping people plan. I think planning is great as long as you're still doing it with open hands. You know what I mean? You
Yeah.
can you can open your hands and say, I've got bullet point one, bullet point two, bullet point three. I want to do this. I want to do this. But you're still opening your hands, even though you've got pen on your fingers, like you're still opening your hands to the Lord and saying, you could change this completely, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And so
What's
it's
that
that,
verse that says like the man plans his steps, but the Lord, how does it go?
oh, man plans his steps, but the Lord,
Directs his way or something like
yeah,
that.
something like that. Y'all, we just butchered it, but woo, it's there. It's somewhere in there.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh man. But yeah, like that's that principle of like we plan, we make plans, we steward the resources God has given us, and that requires some planning and some thoughtfulness, and yet we still have open hands to what the Lord is doing. And I'm going to leave it there because honestly, we will do another episode on that, by the
Yeah,
way.
that'd actually be a really good episode for
It
the
would
beginning
be.
of the
Yeah.
year.
Yeah, it would be. Absolutely. Oh, what fun. What an all over the place episode.
It kind of stayed on track.
we,
Couple
we did
tangents.
great. Oh man. Well, thank you for listening. And as always, we'll see you on the next one.
Bye.